All right, stand by, everybody, and good morning, America. How are you? This is Carlos Saldivia speaking to you from Williamsport, Pennsylvania this morning, and our show Pushback, presented by Pennsylvania Patriots Radio. This morning it's raining in Williamsport because God is crying that our elites all over the country are doing nothing in the face of what's going on. So I wanted to tell everybody that this is a show where we put together arguments and present them for people who are interested in standing up on their own 2 feet and defending the values of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and specifically the Bill of Rights. That's who we want to talk to. That's our market. And to do that, we have our friends Robert Knorr from Clarion County. Good morning, Robert.
Good morning.
And our host and our friend Todd Bartley from Williamsport, Pennsylvania, but today is streaming remotely. How are you, Todd?
Good, Carlos, from the undisclosed bunker location.
I gotcha. So before we kick it to Todd, I wanted to do a very, very, very short opening today. And the opening is something that Robert asked me actually last night in our pre-production meeting. He said, I think I know what you think, but what's your best argument regarding tearing down statues? And, I thought about it and I understood what he meant. You could have reasons and they might not be logical ones. And you could have arguments that might not make any sense. But for me, the very best reason not to tear down statues is the fact that they are the very best representation of American healing. It's Americans healing. It wasn't a fight that we had with the British or with the Chinese or with the Russians. It was a fight we had with other Americans. And the consignment was we were fighting against other Americans. That's why there's statues to Robert E. Lee, to be able to give context to the fact that they were Americans and they loved their country. And if you think that this was a fight about just racism and someone like a Robert E. Lee didn't love their country, you need to do more reading. That being said, speaking of reading, a voracious reader himself, Todd Bartley, what's going on today?
So we are in the process of being joined later this morning. And
we are in the process of being implemented
by the newly appointed Speaker of the House in the state of Pennsylvania, Brian Cutler.
You got some double audio going on, Todd.
Yeah.
And in fact, he's now joining us.
Okay, fantastic. So the new Speaker of the House is Representative Brian Cutler. And for those who live in Pennsylvania, you might have seen some of the representatives' work in action. And go ahead, Todd.
So first of all, Speaker, can you hear all of us? That's the first question.
Oh.
And if he'll unmute, we'll be able to hear him.
You're on mute.
There we go.
I got you guys good.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. First of all, thank you for joining us on a Saturday morning.
Happy to do it. Thanks for having me.
This is the conclusion of your first week as the newly elected, newly appointed Speaker of the House, is it not?
It was, yes. Was elected on Monday, and then we were still in session Tuesday and Wednesday.
Can you walk us through the process that brought you to the Speaker position with the resignation retirement of former Speaker Turzai, and then walk us through that moment that you know that you're going to be in the rostrum presenting as the new Speaker and giving your opening remarks?
Sure. Previously I'd served as the majority leader. That was my role when Speaker Torzai had stated that he was not going to run for re-election, and then he subsequently decided to leave a little early. As the majority leader, I became the automatic presiding officer, I believe is the term that they use in the statute, which essentially means I was the person who was served with all the lawsuit paperwork if we were sued between the time when he left and we elected a new speaker. He left, and we read his resignation letter across the desk on June the 15th, I believe. And then we set up leadership elections for the following week. Typically, we give everyone a week to call through the caucus and see if they have support for different positions. And from that point on the 15th and on, started making my calls, had, as was demonstrated by the vote, overwhelming support. And being on the House floor, obviously it's still a House vote. It's a floor vote. So you're always nervous till the board gets locked, and was kind of watching the board and was very grateful for bipartisan support for me to become the next Speaker of the House.
If you would, and then I'll welcome in Robert and Carlos as well for questions for you, Speaker Cutler. One of the things that was going on just prior to your election as the new Speaker was, you mentioned the litigation paperwork, was in fact the litigation with HR 836 and all that litigation to go to Commonwealth Court, now in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, in regard to Governor Wolf, the executive orders. Your presentation, if I may take a moment of personal privilege, I watched your entire presentation. I watched you go left to right, from the notepad to the prepared comments that you had as well. I know you are a legal professional by trade before you came to the House of Representatives. I must say, just as a layperson, as an observer, I've seen cases presented before. I've read immense case law and presentation materials and everything else. I must say, from a personal standpoint, that was one of the single most impressive presentations I think I've ever seen at any level, let alone in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives.
Oh, thanks, Todd. Yeah, I'll actually back up a little bit. Believe it or not, I started out as an X-ray technologist. That was my original career path out of high school, and then ultimately went to law school for healthcare law. And I really enjoy floor debate. That was actually, for me, one of the biggest concerns about becoming the speaker, is obviously you're not in the day-to-day throes of the debate on the floor on the issues, and you're really more of an umpire. So that was one of my concerns, because I do love the debate and the back and forth so much, and I really enjoy the legislative process. But I really appreciate you saying that. We put a lot of work into that. I know Representative Diamond, who had originally started that project with the HR 836 and moved it through the committee. And then when we brought it up on the floor, I thought it was very important to have the requisite background as we headed to the courts, because we knew ultimately that's where this was going to end up. So we wanted to lay out the statutory authority and the process that we believe was outlined not only in the statutes, but also the court kind of alluded to it in the Danny DeVito case, where they were talking about some of the other provisions that regarding the emergency process, if you will, where they would, the governor could start it and we could stop it. They clearly didn't say, the legislature and the governor could stop it. They said the legislature can stop it. So now the next step in the statute is the governor shall issue an order terminating the disaster, which he has not done yet, which is why we ended up in court. And it was expedited the whole way up to the Supreme Court, because I think everybody recognizes that's where it was ultimately going to end up anyway. And this issue's too important to let it languish for weeks or months in the court system.
Thank you so much for being here, Speaker Cutler. Rob Noor from Clarion County. I also watched it and thought it was impressive. For our audience, not necessarily the legal backing and the case names and things like that, can you just briefly explain why it's important to not leave these sort of unchecked executive powers?
Well, I think if you go back to our constitutional foundations, I think that's really the starting point, and the idea of the balance of powers between the three branches of government. And in this particular instance, if you would interpret the statute as the governor implies that they believe that they are operating under, it would mean, and I highlighted this during some of my comments, it would mean that a governor and 1/3 of one chamber through an emergency order could essentially do whatever they wanted to do. And that, I think, is directly contrary to the foundational principles of the idea of a balance of power or checks and balances, because a minority of one chamber and one person in the other branch, I think, running everything for 4 years just because there happens to be an emergency declaration, I think would be fundamentally unfair and would be the exact opposite of what we were looking for. So I think you have to put a dose of common sense in as you evaluate both that statute, the legal reasoning behind that. It's really a body of administrative law, and the statute that we were operating under is known as the enabling statute, and it was a limited delegation of power to the governor. And so we as the legislature had delegated, and he signed that into law, but we also put the mechanism in which we could take it back. And we simply were exercising that mechanism is really what it came down to.
Carlos?
Good morning, Representative, and congratulations on your new role. We are looking forward for you to be an active leader. I'm sure you understand how we feel in the outer stretches of Pennsylvania, that we need people to speak up and defend our values and our rights. So I am very excited for you to be in a position to do that. As an aside, there's a moral ground for invoking emergencies, and some of them are very humane. And that is because in order to justify its special powers, the government must create a class of officially designated bad guys, malefactors, if you will. And those malefactors are us, the sovereign, but also the infected from the coronavirus. Can you talk to us about how did you feel as an elected leader when we were being treated as the infected?
Well, I think I'll go back a little bit into the early days of the pandemic, because I think it's important to have the context. There was a lot of unknowns, and quite frankly, there's still a lot of unknowns. And this really, I think, goes to Robert's question regarding the balance of powers, quite honestly, because when we started, there was a lot of unknowns. And I think we were all willing to give everyone the benefit of the doubt in terms of how that would start to unroll, if you will. And as we progressed, though, what actually happened on the ground was you had the executive who had issued an order and then essentially cut out the legislature, which was, we are the people's representatives. We said it several times during the debate through I think it was 13 weeks that we did different reopening bills and ultimately led up to the termination. As we worked through those components, it was extremely frustrating to think that the people's voice had been shut out of the process. No, I don't think anybody argued whether or not the actions that were undertaken originally were well intended. The problem was they were not always as well informed as they should have been in terms of the process, in terms of the impact. And we really have two crises right now. And we've continued to have it. It's not just the healthcare crisis. You've also got this economic crisis, which is they're running in tandem with each other. And the health crisis and the shutdowns clearly driving the economic crisis. But you can't solely focus on one to the exclusion of the other. And that's really where the problems have come in, is because I think that the governor and the health secretary, and that's her job, is to focus on the health. We're focusing on the health. But it was to the exclusion of what the economic impact would be or what could be reasonable. The example that we often use during the debate in terms of business reopening was I actually thought the governor and the secretary were asking the wrong set of questions. they deemed businesses to be essential and non-essential. But the other two components that I think that should have been asked is who can operate safely and who cannot. Because when you look at a grocery store, for example, or a hospital, I think we would all agree that they're absolutely essential businesses. They're not necessarily the safest places to go, though, if there's large crowds or you're not taking some minimal safety measures. So while they were essential, you also had this component of, well, you're going to have to make some modifications to make them a little safer. And so I think, and I had an example here. I shared it on the House floor. I had a gentleman who was a surveyor, who is a one-man shop. He only has himself as an employee. And because his line of work was deemed to not fit into any of those categories as being essential or enough to continue, he was told he could not work. But yet, at the same time, the administration was telling him he could go walk in the woods, he could go hike and get outside and get fresh air, but he wasn't allowed to work. And it just seems so contrary to me. So as an elected official and as a citizen, I was just extremely frustrated that it seemed that there was not adequate input into that thought process as things progressed. And it's okay to initially make a mistake. It's another one to keep doubling down on it as you go forward. And we saw the waiver process, which was an absolute disaster. The arbitrary nature at which some companies were approved and some were denied, and yet they did exactly the same things, and nobody really understood. We got a lot of complaints from people who had competitors who either never thought they had to apply for a waiver, or they just ignored it, and or they got one. So there were kind of three different groups of people, and that confusion, I think, just led to a lot of the frustration. And that's really the frustrating part for me as an elected official and me as a citizen is I would have really liked to have more inputs into that process. And quite frankly, that's what we, the legislature, as the elected representatives of the people, are supposed to do, is to be their voice in that process.
Well, the thing that we would like to submit, us three, for you in your goodie bag to take back to Harrisburg is the following idea. And it was punctuated by Robert so clearly, Speaker, months ago. And this is what he said. We don't know what's going to happen. We think that there's going to be 100,000 deaths in Pennsylvania. We think that this is really, really bad. And we're telling you the truth so that you can decide what you should do as Americans based on the lens of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution first. Because we trust you, not you guys are infected and we have to protect you. I'm sorry, you're absolutely right. And I want to make sure that I say this to you because what you brought up in terms of the example of like the big guys against the little guys, the non-essentials and the essentials. There is a county commissioner in Lycoming County who owns a carpet store. And he has to compete against Lowe's, who was open the entire time, and he wasn't. When you just said what you just said, looking back on it, wouldn't it have been a better idea, a safer idea, if all the major companies, like, let's say, all the supermarkets and all the Lowe's and all those type of, they were closed and only the mom and pops were open, and you let them decide who comes in, who wears a mask. Give us the tools to decide for ourselves. Don't decide for ourselves. That's the message that we're trying to, and the idea that we're trying to, and the argument that we're trying to push forward so that our leaders understand that. That being said, what is it that we as people, we as the voters, what is it that we don't understand about the system? What frustrates you the most about what the people don't understand about the work that all of you do?
That's actually a great question, Carlos, and I really appreciate it. I want to echo one of the things that you said. I think we're kindred spirits in terms of being very libertarian. I just want, in many ways, the government to leave me alone and to allow me to make my decisions for me and my family. And that's always kind of been what my philosophy is rooted in, because, and I think this crisis proves it, you can't have a one size fits all approach to this problem. The solutions in your example of Lycoming County, which is certainly much more rural than Philadelphia County, those are two different scenarios that need two different approaches. And I think, as we went forward, and that was what we argued was, individuals, we as consumers, we as customers would be the people who naturally made those decisions and essentially self-limited that level of activity as we would, choose to either, go get a haircut or go to the store, whatever we were going to do. I think even had things been completely open, some people would have naturally been more cautious, and quite frankly, they should.
Exactly.
Individuals who, like, I think of my grandmother. She's 85. Lives at home. We went to the grocery store in the early days words because of the unknown factor, and now she's reached a point where she's kind of said, well, I've had a good life, and I want to go back to living it. And that's just her approach. I think one of the most frustrating parts is really it was interesting. We were told all along, trust the experts, trust the people. The problem is the experts' opinions themselves change sometimes throughout this whole process from start to finish. But then the one thing we never heard was, trust the people and trust each other. We I think overwhelmingly, we would do research, we would be that self-limiting factor. And I think that as we move forward, one of the things I'd encourage you to continue to share is to have folks contact their local representatives. I get a lot of foot traffic, a lot of emails, a lot of phone calls in my office about a lot of different issues. And I certainly always enjoy hearing that because it's important to get that perspective. But I'm not sure that that's the same all across the Commonwealth. I think a lot of people tend to, only get their information from one outlet or maybe two. They don't really get a diverse input of opinions. And because of that, their natural starting point sometimes, I think, ends up being, either on the left or on the right. And then there's this lack of interest in moving or hearing from other folks. I think what we demonstrated through the legislative process is really what needs to happen more, which is, listen, here's my idea, here's your idea, let's put it up for a vote. Let's have that conversation. And, in terms of the reopening bills for the different businesses and the mom and pop stores, as you called them, and we did too during the floor debate, they, I always thought they'd be much safer than a huge Lowe's or a Walmart or, any of the other stores that were referenced at that time. So I think that we should have been given that opportunity. That's obviously why we passed a lot of those bills. But most importantly, the business owners should have been given that opportunity because I really believe that our businesses and our entrepreneurs, they'd figure out a way to continue operations in some form. Look, we're doing a Zoom meeting instead of an in-person meeting. We quickly adopted the technology during the last 3 months. My kids went from physically going to school to learning through Zoom meetings and Microsoft Teams, and it worked. Maybe it didn't work quite the way that the old way worked, or as much as or worked as well as we would like. But the truth is, it did work. And we were able to figure our way out through it if we were given the freedom to do that. And I just think that that's an important component of it, to be honest.
One of the things that I wanted to point out, so I think you correctly isolate the problems of having an executive basically make these decrees without the problems with that constitutionally and why that leads to all sorts of things. But if I can add to this, I think you're right to assume good faith and maybe they just made mistakes at the beginning. But I think that it's worth thinking about whether that's really the case with what we know now. For example, not only were these decrees issued with the ignoring the will of the people in their voting, but then it was done in a smug way, such as the claim that anyone who had problems with this wanted elderly people to die. And the claim, you remember his speech where he said, Governor Wolf said, it's the cowards in the legislature. It's cowardly and will take away people's right to operate businesses if they decide they want to open up. When you juxtapose that within the fact that Tom Wolf, in his arrogance, actually broke his own executive order, which said that you couldn't be involved in gatherings of more than so many people. He couldn't wait to jump at the opportunity to get a photo up with Black Lives Matter and next to a person holding a sign that says Blue Lives Murder. So I'm wondering, do you still think that this was good faith when you see the contempt that he treated people and his team treated people that disagreed, and then the fact that as soon as they got the opportunity, they were willing to break their own decrees that they had ordered?
Well, I think it's one of the classic problems, to be honest, that folks have, and I've always had with government, and that's government saying, do as I say, not as I do. And I think that's really the frustration that you're kind of getting to. And it was one of my own, because to your point, it didn't make sense to me that you say, you can't go to gatherings, and then we saw how that played out. And yet the individuals who showed up to lobby for the businesses to reopen were going to kill people. That was the press statements at that time, when the Reopen PA folks came up. So it is very frustrating. That's one of the reasons why, as leader and now as speaker, I've tried to be kind of that even-keeled voice of reason as we go through the process. I think a lot of it was born, honestly, Robert, out of just not knowing. And because look, I mean, it's novel, it's novel, it's new, it's called that for a reason. But now as we're learning more, I think we've got to be willing to modify our approach. Quite honestly, I think you've seen it from the governor already. And I don't know if HR 836 played a role in it, or other pieces of the economic push with the reopeners, or whatever the reasons were. We were told for a while, you had to get, I think, to 50 cases per 100,000. They had these numeric metrics, and the southeastern counties, which unfortunately included Lancaster by numbers, so Lancaster, Chester, Bucks, Delaware, Montgomery, and Philadelphia, they were nowhere near those numbers when they were moved to green. And so I am somewhat heartened in the fact that there's some changes being made. I'm still a little confused on the numbers and why they were chosen. I'm also a little confused on how the whole waiver process worked. I think that a lot of it was just simply being overwhelmed with lack of information, and then having to make a lot of decisions all at once. I just think it was really a volume problem more than anything. And it was very frustrating. And I think that's what you're seeing, that's what I'm seeing when I go out to the grocery store, or, people call the office, is that frustration of, well, we were told we couldn't do this for weeks, and now these people in the government are doing this. And why is that? Or why are they allowed to do this and not us? And it's, and I live on the southern border of the state. I'm about 8-10 minutes out of Maryland, and Maryland opened up long before we did. And so it's only natural, because the boundary is only one that exists on the map. Individuals here were going to Maryland, to spend their money and to buy things or get their hair cut, or, fill in the blank. So it really, it could have been handled much better. I think everybody would agree with that. I think, we could have done some things differently, probably in the legislative process as well. We'll certainly learn from that. And it's never easy, but I think that we've got to be willing to adapt and adopt new strategies as new information becomes available. And I just didn't see that happen this time.
Yeah, Speaker Cutler, if I may, and we live in arguably one of the most divided times in our nation's history, unfortunately. For whatever reason, how we got here, it's inexplicable how we've gotten to this point. You serve in a chamber that the rostrum was taken over by colleagues of the Black Caucus here in recent weeks. I was in the room at Pima and asked the governor what I thought was a unifying type of question of, if we're going to have the conversation on race relations in the Commonwealth, how can we start that conversation to move the Commonwealth forward, to kind of heal? I didn't use the word heal, but to move the Commonwealth forward. His response to me was quite stunning, that the governor would say that we have two Pennsylvanias, one for those that are Black and one for those that are not. as Speaker of the House now, having seen what you've seen in the rostrum, and now having that gavel, what's your reaction to the governor? And again, how do we have a fruitful conversation without being called, as one of our local school board members has just codified and put in a resolution, that it's systemically racist?
No, it's a good question, and one that, quite frankly, needs to be answered, Todd. I don't personally believe that there's two Pennsylvanians. I just believe that there is Pennsylvania, and we're all citizens. I think that there's some important issues that we have to discuss in terms of, this week it was police reform bills that we moved, but and if you talk to anybody in the chamber, they'll tell you this. I'm sort of a stickler for the rules. And protocols and constitutional issues. That's something that's always been very important to me. So much to the fact that there have been times where I'm like one of a handful of people that were a no vote because I thought that a bill was just unconstitutional. And I've had those conversations. One of the distinctions, I think, of kind of my time in the legislature is that most of my major legislative issues that I've worked on during my time and tenure there, it always started with an idea. I took that idea to some of my friends on the other side of the aisle. I'm a Republican, obviously, so I would talk to the Democrats. I'd find somebody who also was interested in that issue. We'd take those two, the two ideas, and then we would work that to a bill that we thought could get consensus. And that product, and look, these were not always easy bills. It was bills that dealt with healthcare, and it was bills that dealt with welfare fraud, and it was bills that dealt with our lobbying registration system. It was things that literally had not been touched in decades that we were able to work through. And is it easy? No. Does it take a lot of work? Yes. And I recognize the concerns regarding some of the police reforms that are needed. And we had that conversation, and we ended up having two bills that passed unanimously because when we sat down as colleagues and understood each other's positions and figured out where we could go. And unfortunately, to your point, Todd, I think in today's world, too often people want to immediately go to either corner and say, well, I'm right, you're wrong, and there's nothing in between. And I don't believe that. I said it during my speech as speaker. I had said it as when I was sworn in as leader about 18 months ago now. I was raised by my dad and my mom and dad, who are both passed. They had really three simple rules. One was, that you treat everyone with respect. The second one was that you never ask people to do something you yourself aren't willing to do, which kind of goes to Robert's point about some of the governmental requests and orders. And the third is that you always try to leave things better than you found it. Those were just life lessons that my dad taught me. Obviously, I was 18 when he passed away, so he left much too soon. But the truth is, I think those life lessons, they transcend any situation, any issue. You can bring that in that approach. I think you're always going to find answers. And I recognize that not everybody agrees with that. There are some in the chamber, and this is not a political affiliation because it happens on both sides, that just simply it is all or nothing all the time. And that makes it challenging, but it's our job to govern. And that's what we're going to work through and do. We'll find those areas of commonality where we can. One of the things I did as whip, did it as leader, and intend to keep doing it as speaker, was it was important for me. Look, I grew up in a southern Lancaster County, which is an agricultural community, and I worked in healthcare. We're fairly rural, even though Lancaster County is a very populous county. Well, we tend to be centered in the northern part of the counties where all of our population is. Where I live is still fairly rural. And I recognized, despite having grown up here, that not everywhere was like here. And so I made a point of going to other people's districts and just saying, hey, what's your biggest business? What's your biggest issue? What's your biggest problems? And as I did that, I really got an appreciation for those different perspectives of those different representatives. And that's both R and D. I spent some time in Philly. I've spent time in Pittsburgh. What somebody invited me out, I went. And it's really been an eye-opening experience in terms of what some of the struggles are in other parts of the Commonwealth. But I think ultimately it has to start with respect, and we have to all agree that this is the process by which we're going to fix these problems. In the case of legislation and in the case of the bills that we passed this week, that process was the committee process. That's where it started. That's where we moved things through, and it worked. And I think that's the vision that our founders had when they laid the framework in the Constitution in terms of the balance of power and the representation of people and the balance between the legislature and the executive. I think that still works, and I think we just need to keep our eye on the goal, which is to make the Commonwealth better and to respect one another as friends and neighbors, even if our political views may be very, very different, because that's ultimately how we'll be successful.
I do have a brief follow-up. You brought up the constitutionality. If you would address briefly the idea of retroactivity when it comes to bills and legislation, because from a perception standpoint, it seems as if those potentially on the other side of the aisle like to go back into history and want to do a lot of clean slate legislation. But when it comes to something like Megan's Law, they want to rule it unconstitutional, right, to go back and maybe apply to someone that may have fallen through the cracks, even though the level of the crime fits exactly to the letter of the law. What's your reaction to that?
It's one of the struggles that we've had from a constitutional standpoint, and the case law, not having all of it in front of me, is kind of all over the place, to your point, Todd. In some cases they allow it and some they do not. I do have concerns about some of the ex post facto components of some of the law changes, and that's also been tax code changes. There's been a whole host of things that, both state and federally, they went back and made retroactive. There are times when I think it's understandable. For example, if you had something in place and then the legislation just didn't get done in time, and you say, but it goes back to the last time that you did it, that seems to make sense to me, because it's just a continuation of a standard where you already had something. The idea that you can go back and simply create a new crime retrospectively always causes me concern, because decisions will have been made or action will have been taken under a series of assumptions at that time that quite honestly may no longer be true. And that I think does throw some serious constitutional monkey wrenches into it. And we've had different components of our Megan's Law, to your point, thrown out. And I think it was the Adam Walsh Act federally, some of the state components of that were challenged because of the retroactive component. So it's something that we have to be mindful of as we work through that legislative process. And unfortunately, I'm not sure that there's a real clear answer given the case law.
Final questions, Robert?
Yeah. So this is kind of a difficult one, but look, here's the truth. I think this is what most conservative-leaning Pennsylvanians and Americans are thinking. I understand as Speaker of the House, you have a very important and awesome responsibility when it comes to the legislative process and things like that. But I also believe that politics is downstream of culture. And we see this happening more in the federal government, but I think it's happening in Pennsylvania as well. It seems that many people, myself included, are wondering where are Republican voices stepping up in the public relations sphere to all of these people talking about how racist this country is, how we need to burn down the history of this country, how we need to get rid of institutions in this country. It seems like Republican leadership is either being silent, or worse, people like Lindsey Graham are actually giving lip service to, oh yes, I understand 100% of people of color have had horrible relations with the police based on their color. What is the plan on your level and with the Republicans, of how to get back into that public relations battle and start talking to people in these communities and start changing the narrative we see in all of these institutions, such as the media, such as academia, that says this is a terrible racist country?
Well, first of all, I think we live in the best country in the world. And I think historically that has proven that out. You know, I think that education is a great opportunity and it's a great equalizer here. We could certainly argue that that's not always been available to everyone. And I do also agree that, particularly even now, there are some schools that are failing kids miserably, and that's regardless of the color of their skin. And so we need to make sure that all kids have those kinds of opportunities. In terms of the media piece, that's something that I've always struggled with, and not that I've struggled with communicating, but I've struggled with the fact that it seems that the media sometimes ignores different components that we have of our message. And what I have found is, honestly, and it's something that the president does effectively, is he just goes directly to the people. He goes right through Twitter, he goes right through Facebook, and you can do that in today's world. When I first started 13 years ago, none of those forums were even really available. And I think what you're seeing, Robert, is kind of a tension between the new media and the new way that people get news versus the old media, which is really dying. I know our local paper laid off a bunch of people, and it's a challenge because they don't have the opportunity to dig into stories the way that they once did. And a lot of times I think they end up running, kind of the national AP version of the story as opposed to what I'll call the local flavor. And that's important to me, to have that local flavor, because when I first ran, we had two papers here, two daily papers here in Lancaster County. And one was pretty much viewed as the Republican, and one was viewed as the Democrat paper. And that, I think that was pretty standard in a lot of communities. But the point was, you had two opposing points of view, and their editorial boards would sometimes spar back and forth. And, it was an exchange of good ideas, in my opinion. And when you lose the ability to exchange those ideas, I think you lose an element of civility, and then you also lose the narrative. And so I think that we've got to figure out a way, and that's just we as in citizens have to figure out a way to share our viewpoints. I'm not a big Facebooker. It's just not my thing. But I do try to go out. I do interviews. I sit with editorial boards. Like I still kind of straddle both media formats, or whatever term you want to use. But I think it's important to learn history. I think it's important to understand, a couple hours west of where I live, you had the Battle of Gettysburg, where the Union troops were successful. That history is important. I think a lot of Pennsylvanians have a connection to that history. They may have had family members who served in the military, and that deserves to be honored and recognized. And because it is a dark time in our history, but it's also one, it was the birth of the Republican Party. It was the birth of abolitionism. All of those things I think play into it. And I'm not hearing an awful lot about that right now. And I just think that's important, because structurally, I think that we need to put policies in place to talk about opportunity, to talk about lifting people up, but doing it in a way that's consistent with American ideals, and making sure that we get the freedom to choose. Do you want to? And I'll use schooling as an example because I think it's important. I was not a good student when I was in school. It's funny, I still talk to some of my teachers and they don't remember that, but I've showed them my report cards, which prove otherwise. And, the reason I share that is because I was not a great student in a traditional learning model. And I see that in my own kids. Some of my kids do much better with online courses than others. And some of my kids do much better with hands-on experiments. And, so every kid is different. And yet our educational institution system really has not significantly changed in decades. My kids go to the same high school. Now it's been added on to, but it's the same structural building that my dad went to and that my mom went to. And so they're grandparents. So you have to ask yourself, how do you advance those opportunities, advance those chances in this system And I think it starts with policies. I think it starts with recognitions that everybody are unique individuals, and that we have different learning traits and abilities to get there. But I think that as a party and then the ability to communicate, it's one that I've tried very hard to make myself available. But at the end of the day, we can't make anybody print anything. They'll print whatever they feel is newsworthy. And when you have a limited number of outlets, I think it naturally limits the opinions as well, which is part of the problem in that discourse, because there is no healthy tension anymore. There's only one paper that's essentially pitching the AP version and not the local flavor version. And that's nothing against the AP reporters, because I think some of them are very, very good. But the problem is you're not getting the in-depth work that we once saw. And when you start to lose that local personal connection, it's easy to dismiss it as, well, that's not here, or that's not us, or that's not how I see it. And that's a problem, I think.
Speaker, we know that you have to go, so I don't have any more questions, but I want to make sure that we would like to have you be our guest in Williamsport sometime, and to look at the city of Williamsport and our community through the eyes of regular people, not the elites. You hear what I'm saying?
I do.
And I would like to be able to, before I throw it to Todd, can you give us the very best one or two things that you want us to take away in the Speaker Cutler goodie bag?
Well, if it doesn't put you guys over time wise, I'll give you a couple.
No.
First thing, Carlos, I'd love to come up. I belong to a hunting camp, and by calling it a camp, it probably insults several very well-made buildings. It's literally a shack in the woods with no running water. But my grandfather,
the best.
Yeah, my grandfather built it in the 1940s. It's outside Cattersport, so I always come up to Williamsport and go out the backside of town and hang a hard left up at Liberty. So I'm very familiar with your area, and so I'd love to come up and see Williamsport. I know the history of the town. It's a fascinating town, but I also think the people are just real good, salt of the earth people that care about their friends and their neighbors. And it's just like it is down here in Lancaster County. When my parents got sick, I was 15 when my mom was originally diagnosed. And then my dad died when I was 18, and my mom passed when I was about 24. The reason I share that is because my younger sister and I, we never had to do anything, like in terms of make meals, like we heat our house with firewood, still do, much to my kids' disappointment. They help us split and stack wood. The reason I share that is because, the Lions Club, the church, the Farm Women's Association, everybody came to help. And that is, to me, what makes Pennsylvania so great, because I see that in every little neighborhood. Somebody gets sick, somebody dies, or something bad happens, our friends and our neighbors show up. I think, and I guess this would probably come out of the goodie bag request, I think that we need to keep doing that. I think that we need to keep treating one another like friends and neighbors and not enemies.
Well, you have a friend in Williamsport, that's for sure.
Thank you.
Speaker Cutler, I can't thank you enough. I mean, what a whirlwind week for you, with being elected and sworn in as a speaker, and then to take nearly an hour with us on your first Saturday as speaker. Can't thank you enough. And as Carlos mentioned, I'm sure Rob said the same thing. We can't wait to welcome you to Williamsport at some point in the future, and for an in-person visit. We've got two, amazing colleges in Lycoming College and Penn College to maybe sit down and have those conversations with those folks, those students interacting with the Speaker of the House. And again, just can't thank you enough.
Well, Todd, I've actually already toured Penn Tech. A good friend of mine took the electrical program up there, and I was up about 9 months ago, before obviously all this other stuff started, because being an X-ray tech, I still keep my license up because I always joke that I'm always, 2 years away from possibly needing another job. Mm-hmm. The truth is, I'm a big fan of trade schools. I'm a big fan of the 2-year technical programs, because that is a gap that I see in our economy. You want to talk about opportunity. You want to talk about getting out of school, making great money, and not having student debt. That's it. And we could do a whole show on that, and I would love that, because that is something where I think that as a government and as policies, we focused and sent folks to college, 4-year college, for too long. Like, we need to figure out what the economy needs, what businesses need, and what works. But I'd love to come back up. I'd love to visit with everyone, and I want to wish everyone a great weekend and a happy 4th of July.
Not to mention that being an X-ray technician comes in handy to be able to see through Democrats.
That's good stuff.
Thank you so much, Speaker Cutler, and looking forward to that future visit.
Thanks, you.
Guys.
So that is the Pennsylvania Speaker of the House, Brian Cutler, with us here on a Saturday, taking great time with us, and we can't thank him enough for being here.
Yes, that was fantastic. I wanted to thank Todd Bartley for facilitating that visit with the speaker. So a couple of takeaways from what the speaker said. I don't understand the part of how you can get elected to any house. Forget about Pennsylvania, any house, okay? And not bring as the tip of your spear goodwill. How does that happen? When did we lose that, Todd?
You know, Carlos, it's a great point. And we mentioned it a little while ago about the genuineness, if you will, for lack of a better term, of a conversation, of an argument, if you will, or debate. When you're bringing in the conversation starter of you are systemically racist just because the color of your skin, not knowing anything about me, not knowing anything about you, not knowing anything about Rob, not knowing anything about Speaker, it's disingenuous. It's absolutely disingenuous. You don't know my background. You don't know my history. And we don't even know each other. And we're starting the conversation off with, you're a racist, systemically. It's disgusting.
Well, and
Rob,
yeah, if
go ahead,
you look,
Rob.
So the book that's being cited now, which it's very ironic, we're starting to see things analogous to the Great Leap Forward in Mao's China. They had the Little Red Book in China. Here we have the book White Fragility, written by a white woman who's a consultant. And here's basically the argument. There's white privilege. You were born with this original sin. If you disagree, that's examples of your white fragility. And so you're put into this paradox where it's like, you have to agree with everything I say about the terrible racist nature of our country and of people that are of a certain color, in this case, white. And if you don't, that's proof of the racism. This is what, and it's impossible to have when we see people in roles of leadership, and make no mistake about it, this applies to our political leadership, certainly, but it also applies to other institutions that are equally, if not more important, such as the media, the tech firms, academia, and the entertainment industry. When you have leaders in these institutions that are saying, there's white privilege, this country's systemically racist, it's terrible. Oh, and if you disagree with us, that's proof of your racism. I don't mind them making the claim about systemic racism as long as it's good faith and we can say, but wait a minute, here's things to push back on that. But that's not the way this plays out. And we could see it in the cancel culture where, for example, we saw the gentleman who worked for the LA Galaxy. He was fired. Why? Because his wife criticized Black Lives Matter. And so this is sort of the cancel culture that we're seeing, this argument that, well, the institutions have now decided this is a racist country, systemic racism is prevalent. Ironically, the institutions themselves are supporting the notion that the institutions are racist, which shows you that this is just a naked power grab. Oh, and if you disagree, that proves the racism.
That you're racist.
We can't govern this way. We can't have a cohesive country this way.
In that vein, and I see that Jason has just come on, but I want to follow up with a question. Rob, can you give me an example where racism was solved?
So racism's never been solved, and it never will be, because no matter, human nature is.
But they tell us otherwise.
Right. So I could give you examples of situations where we could see the best inroads being made.
Okay.
So, for example, athletics.
The best inroads as to where racism
it didn't have
has been abated or has been eliminated or
abated. I would say more that because it'll never be eliminated. But look, racism will exist. What we need to do as a culture and as a country is ensure that racism doesn't have power to actually take people's rights away and negatively affect them in a serious way. So athletics, for example, I'm not saying there's no one that's racist in athletics, but what we saw with Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier is the hyper-capitalist nature of athletics, which is win at all costs. That's the most important thing. That helps abate racism because you start to say, if winning's what matters, my prejudice does not matter. And so because of that hyper-competitive nature and saying what we care about most is competency, we care about someone who could get the job done. And Carlos, you've talked about this in your personal life. What was the first barrier you had to kind of breaking through people that had attitudes about you based on where you came from? You are a great ball player. And all of a sudden, you weren't Carlos, the person who looks different than me. You were Carlos, that guy that's helping us win game after game. And
exactly
so
right.
I think the lesson that we could extrapolate from that is the less we focus on race and the more we focus on the principles that made this country great, that of personal responsibility and personal liberty, that's what we need to do to abate racism and the effects that it has negatively on people, because we start to judge people based on what are your actions, what is the content of your character, as opposed on what is your skin color. I think a very famous person said that was a good thing to try to do one time.
Todd, this is a question that I'm going to ask you that will lead into our introduction to our guest, but our leaders lied to us about the virus. What were the top 3 lies in Pennsylvania?
The first biggest lie was the lethality of coronavirus in the general population.
We're all going to die.
Yeah, and as Speaker Cutler mentioned, the model for Philadelphia to deal with the situation was not the same model to deal that need to be used with Lycoming County or Clarion County or Sullivan County, and we've seen that borne out in the numbers. So the lethality was one of the biggest ones, right? And then it dovetails into number 2 with the numbers, right? That was number 2. Is the case counts are all over the map, the death counts are all over the map. It depends on where you live, depends on where you died. It's just there was no commonality to the numbers, which, as you know, the story that Coroner Kiesling and I did when the first 2 deaths in Lycoming County were reported and subsequently removed within 24 hours, it led to more than 200 deaths coming off the rolls. And as Speaker Cutler mentioned a moment ago, I'm the local media guy that's going to do the deep dive on all the COVID death counts, get all the death certificates, and see the asterisk of the people that died with the virus instead of the virus. And we're doing that. It's probably going to take the better part of a year to 18 months to get, more than 5 to 6 to 7,000 death certificates accumulated and do the review. The third biggest thing was, and the speaker hit the nail on the head. How in the world are you deemed an essential and non-essential business? To every business owner, entrepreneur, family in Pennsylvania, that business is absolutely essential and life-sustaining. Leave us alone. Let us make up our own minds. And what we've seen is the economic disaster that was created out of this thing was far worse than the virus. Those are the 3 biggest lies.
So joining us right now from Williamsport, Pennsylvania, is a friend to the show and the president of Penn Strategies, based out of Watsontown, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, is Jason Fitzgerald. Good morning, Jason.
Guys, I'm actually today in our offices in Watsontown, Pennsylvania, working on a Saturday. We've got a lot of work to get done, but thank you guys so much for having me on the show. I come from a long line of Kennedy Democrats, although I'm the first Republican in my family, and Profiles in Courage is my favorite book, and this gentleman certainly are Profiles in Courage, particularly for your work here on the local scene.
So can you tell us a little bit about, for the people that don't know you and don't know your work, can you tell us a little bit about you and your company? And also, I just want to make sure that we check your audio and that all your audio connections are in place, because you're coming in and out.
Now, is that better?
Yes, it sounds like you're dating the Little Mermaid.
I think what I've got to do is learn how to work this microphone a little bit better. Can you hear me well now?
Yeah.
So I just had to move this a little closer. So Penn Strategies is a statewide economic development and grant writing firm. We have about 14 clients throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. What we do is identify grant funding sources, write those grants, and then advocate on behalf of them. But in my spare time, as you guys, I follow a lot of the local and national issues, and to the degree that that I can talk about them, I have a lot of opinions on things, as you know. But that's what Penn Strategies does. So we've helped to write about $200 million in grants for communities across Pennsylvania.
And because Jason is a very modest man, I will do a little bit of flag waving for him. Penn Strategies and Jason Fitzgerald, the contribution that he has made to the city of Williamsport is unequaled by anyone in the tenure that I've been here in Williamsport, and that is 17 years. Penn Strategies and Jason Fitzgerald are in one way or another responsible for so many of the good things that have progressed Williamsport to 2020, including the marriage of Major League Baseball and Little League, and the Major League Little League Classic, and has garnered millions of dollars to the city of Williamsport and the county of Lycoming, not to mention $7.6 million for the levy. That's who Penn Strategies is. That's the dedication and the loyalty and the reverence that Jason Fitzgerald has for the city of Williamsport, and it is precisely why he is on the show today. That being said, I'd like to start off.
Very much appreciate that. That means a lot to me that that people recognize that, and I love the city of Williamsport. As you know, the current mayor has made whatever decisions he's made to dismiss us at this time. That's unfortunate, but my dedication to the city remains intact. And in fact, the fact that he's done that allows me to speak a little bit more. I'm enjoying this, actually, because I can now speak much more frankly about issues in the Williamsport area and the school district and other things. So, the mayor made the decision that he made based upon information that was given to him by finance director and others. Had nothing to do with the fact that we've helped to secure over $20 million in over the last 3 years. I think that I can be involved in the city in a different capacity now, and I can speak my mind more freely. So, Williams leaders didn't want to work with us, but thankfully 14 other municipalities throughout Pennsylvania do. So, thank you for that. It very much means a lot to me that you recognize that.
So the question that I wanted to ask you is, given how badly they performed with the state of the country the way that it is, Jason, and their endless empty promises, how long are the Republican and Democratic Party for this world?
I think the parties have failed the American people. And Donald Trump was able to, at least for me, I've been very proud to be a Republican the last couple of years because of Donald Trump. Prior to that, it was pretty lonely there. I think that the parties have failed the people because they both, there was very little difference between the two parties. They fought for, global interest against the interests of the American people for too long. And nobody was willing to stand up and show some courage and risk, not getting invited to the cocktail parties or being laughed at when you're there until Donald Trump came along. I mean, it's just this small group of elites in a faraway capital that just got together. And that the American people are screwed every time that they show bipartisanship. These trade bills that were passed would always have unanimous support from both parties. The way you know you're getting screwed is when the Republicans and the Democrats are both voting for the same thing. And pardon me for using that language, but I'm very support Donald Trump. I think that this is, you hear it every 4 years, but this actually is a critical election because it's not a matter of whether it's Republican or Democrat. It's whether it's America first or everybody else first. And that doesn't mean that we don't care about the rest of the world. But, the American people and the working men and women that Robert talks about all the time that are like our parents and the people we grew up with, we're constantly getting the shaft by both parties until Donald Trump came along. So I am just, I think that this is the most important election, arguably, since the election of Abraham Lincoln, the first time and maybe the second time that, when he was reelected, in my opinion.
So, Jason, thank you so much for being here again. One of the things, and I'll definitely want to get to that, but the first question I wanted to ask you is, I know in our previous conversation, we talked about doing what we could personally, especially with someone who has expertise in sort of these financial matters, to help people that were struggling through the lockdown. Because one of the things that was sad bipartisanly, I think, was that our government leaders weren't giving good information of how to apply for these loans and grants and things like that. What do you think about the fact that it's sort of become a national conversation piece for many people, particularly on the left, to complain or to make it seem like, well, the people that had a problem with the lockdowns were complaining about not being able to get haircuts. Can you talk a little about the suffering that people went through as a result of the economic crash because of the lockdowns, and how that's very flippant to say it was just about haircuts and insulting?
There are people that called me, grown men and women that were, because they didn't know if their businesses were going to be able to survive. And the way that it was done, look, we're a patriotic country. We're willing to make sacrifices. But it's not fair to say that, one group of people who are speaking out against what they see as wrong. So, for example, the peaceful protests in Harrisburg related to opening the state back up. Dangerous cowards that are spreading a virus around, and then people who are, protesting and rioting, in some cases tearing things down, are social justice warriors. It's got to be one or the other. The coronavirus disappeared for a little while, it seemed to me, and as soon as it became politically, didn't fit the narrative that the folks wanted. So I think that the damage to businesses in Pennsylvania and throughout the country is very real. And these are real people, hardworking folks that are hurting.
Todd?
So, Todd?
Yeah, I was going to say, if I could change gears just for a second and pivot away from coronavirus, I do have a local question that I'd like to ask Jason to kind of weigh in on. Jason, you were referenced and quoted in the Myrtle Beach story, a baseball story. Why can't the Williamsport School District, tell us what happened in Myrtle Beach? This week, we've had a major development in regard to the school district where they passed, I believe on Tuesday night, an anti-racist/racism proclamation declaring that they have systemic racism that they need to address within the district. And soon after, I've done 2 op-ed pieces on Jennifer Lake, who read that into the record and has been a very outspoken person on the protests, the marches, even though she didn't march yesterday in Montoursville. I just wanted to get, first of all, your reaction to seeing a local school district codify the fact that there's systemic racism. And here's the actual resolution that Carlos has now put up on the screen. Whereas we must recognize that racism and hate have no place in our schools, in society. However, we have to understand that racism is systemic and is unconsciously and consciously rooted in our institutions, policies, and practices. What's your reaction to seeing that?
Well, I disagree with it. I think that the Williamsport School District does need to do a lot of work, but it's not on this issue. I have a problem with this. Whenever we have this, these kinds of things, they can address these national issues. And look, racism is wrong. I don't disagree with that. But to say that it's systemic in the Williamsport School District, there are some things that are very systemic in the Williamsport School District. One of the things that comes to mind is ignoring very serious allegations of sexual assault. That's appalling to me. They would take the time to put something out like this, but they wouldn't take the time to investigate very serious allegations. And I don't know, whether we know because the fact that they're John Doe 1 or 2, but boy, it would certainly, if those people were, maybe they're minorities, So, I think that the school district, in my opinion, the leaders, not the great school teachers and others at the Williamsport Area School District, but the leaders of the school district, in my opinion, have zero credibility because of that decision. I have no problem saying that. I don't care what kind of impact it has. I have a lot of friends that have told me, over the years, Fitzgerald, the reason that people don't want to do business with you in Lycoming County, even though, by the way, 5 municipalities and private companies do, is because you speak out all the time. Back to Rob's point about capitalism, the reason folks hire me is even if they don't agree with me, we get it done.
Right.
So I found that the better of a job you do, the more you can speak out on things. But I do not believe that there's any evidence of systemic racism in the school district. But I do believe that there is substantial evidence of ignoring very, very serious problems and frankly, civil rights issues. I mean, for a young person to allegedly be sexually assaulted, and for the leaders of that school district to ignore that are reprehensible. Quite frankly, I don't really want to hear from anybody who's allowed that. They have given up, in my opinion, any degree of credibility. We have all this virtue signaling, which is so annoying to me. Do you know how I determine people's virtue? Based on what they do, based on their actions. People need a virtue signal when they have no virtue. Again, and I this kind of thing, to spend this amount of time. We have the school district that has one of the highest tax rates, not just in Lycoming County, but in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And instead of dealing with ways to fix that problem, and instead of dealing with ways to fix this systemic culture of ignoring serious allegations in the sports program, they decide to take this on because, you know what? This is easy. This gets everybody because it's controversial to stand up against it. They do the easy things, but they won't do the hard things. And if I was on the school board, I'm sorry, I would not have voted for that. And I love that guy. He was one of the profiles in Courage on another show that I did. And I understand why, he felt the need to do that. And I respect his decision because I do not lump him in with that group. If I were on the school board, I wouldn't have agreed to it. I'm sorry.
Jason, before I defer my time to Carlos and Rob here for just a second, it's almost as if the same school district that hired a baseball coach that had 2 previous DUIs showed up to a game intoxicated with another administrator, tried to blame it on cough syrup, and then cites family reasons to quit. Jen Lake almost says to that former head baseball coach with this racism, anti-racist thing, Coach, hold my beer.
And Jen Lake is the person that Jennifer Lake is the person that I guess cited the proclamation on Zoom in their meeting on Tuesday before it was passed. Correct, Todd?
And by the way, fully expect tomorrow her husband, who is a pastor, minister, will use literally the bully pulpit to either cite me by name or the story. You're welcome to use your bully pulpit. We're still waiting for the reply of an invitation to come on this show and have the conversation you claim you want to have about race. We're still waiting, just like the Myrtle Beach Police Department is still waiting on your phone call as a mandated reporter of what you heard no later than June 5th of 2018. I give back my time.
Jason, in a prior life, you were an active participant in getting people elected as your role as a political strategist. And for people that don't understand, just 15 seconds on how that works. There's the candidate, there is the campaign manager, there is the political strategist, and then there's the media strategist. When you talk to people today regarding the problems that we're having in this country, the one culprit, Jason, that gets the most play is the media. The media did this. The media is doing it. Their abdication of being an objective and reasonable purveyor of the facts from the battlefield has been completely lost. From strictly a political, strategic mind, can you comment on where did the media lose its way and why, based on your experience?
I think the reaction to Donald Trump is where they really lost it. You started to see it. There was a love affair with President Obama for 8 years. There are those, we may not all agree. I think he was probably a mediocre president, a little bit less than that. But I think that's where it started. But I think that where the real problems in this country started was when look, I come from a family and even a relationship where, my significant other, and on everything politically, but where, for me, it really seems that this country, the division of this country was crystal clear, is when we've said that a significant percentage of people say that they won't even stand for the flag. If we can't all agree to stand for the same flag, then it seems to me as though we're no longer one country. We're not one United States of America anymore. You can have a difference of opinion. Then Colin Kaepernick has his right to believe whatever he believes. We take it out on the flag. When you can't stand for the same flag, I think we cease to become one country. And that has been the most concerning thing to me. And I think that the media, the fact too, that, they are part of the elite. This thing in Washington, I've been in the room with these people, and it's impressive, I can tell you that. But they love that. They thrive on that. And it's the media, it's the political consultants, it's the lobbyists and the elected officials. And it doesn't matter if they're Republican or Democrat. They all sit around and how great they are and how dumb the rest of us are. And President Trump came in, Donald Trump came in 2016 and shook that up. He doesn't care what those people think about him. And that's the thing that I admire the most about the man. Is he perfect in every way? No, but you know what? Neither of us. But I like the fact that the guy says what he thinks what he says, and he's not afraid of these people. He doesn't want to be liked by them. And in that sense, on a smaller scale, all of us, and in Harrisburg and Williamsport, I don't care what they think about me. And Carlos, I learned this from you. I used to care, and I'll tell you from a business standpoint, the less that I cared about what the establishment and the elites in the greater Williamsport area thought about me, the more successful my business was. So that could be a lesson to everybody, because everybody used to warn me, don't be, you're going to lose businesses, gain business as a result of this. People like it, because at the end of the day, people decide to do business with somebody in my line of work based upon your success ratio. If I get you $2 million, you don't care if it takes me 10 minutes to do it. You don't care if I'm saying negative things about the school district, because I got you money. And I don't mean to sound so, whatever about it, but that's where I think the media failed is when they failed to see the American people, and they look at us, and Rob talks about it all the time. Average everyday working people who made this country, they look at us like we're less than them. And if we wanted to take a day off and all the working men and women just decide, hey, we're not going to do our jobs for the day, they can see how important we are. Because without those of us that are working and building this country every day, regular working people, like my dad that works the overhead door, my mother who works in the deli at Wise Markets at Jersey Shore during this whole COVID situation, she never missed a single day of work. And you know why she stayed? It wasn't because she had to financially. It was out of a sense of responsibility. Right. And she wanted to be able to be there so that some of the people who had legitimate concerns, who had children and other things, could take the time off, because she felt, my health is good enough. I don't have kids at home, not taking care of elderly parents. I can be here to be helpful. And, it's those Americans, those patriotic Americans that I love that you guys stand up for, every day, and that are so important. And the media has forgotten about us. And you know what? We've forgotten about them, and they're going to go away, and we're not.
Well, the core of the idea that I have always posited with respect to not caring about what other people think, that's the sexy extrapolation of this argument. The odds of being born are 1 in 400 trillion. We are all individuals. There's no one like all of us for individuals. No one talks like Robert Knorr. No one thinks like Robert Knorr. No one looks like him. No one sings like him. No one loves like him. No one expresses themselves like him. So we are all individuals. In that individuality comes the idea of integrity. With so many voices in the stratosphere, which ones do you trust? The ones that are consistent, the ones that are objectively consistent. So if you say what's on your mind and you're truthful about it and you're honest about it, no matter how outrageous that opinion will be, people will trust the fact that what you're saying is true, because you're not trying to be 19 different things for 50 different people to try to appease everyone. When we start this show, Jason, we are very clear as to who our market is. We want to talk to people who are interested in standing on their own 2 feet and defending this country based on the ideals and the lens of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, and the Bill of Rights. We don't want to talk to anybody else. We only want to talk to those people that want to be able to arm themselves, to stand on their own 2 feet and defend our country based on that lens. That's why it's important. Not because you can get things done. There's millions of people that can get things done. Okay, even Nancy Pelosi can get things done. One of the things that I appreciate about her, she's strong, But the more important thing is to be a distinct voice and not sound like anyone else, because that's what people expect. It's the strength of what we offer as Todd and Carlos and Robert. We're individuals and we have individual ideas. And yes, we kind of come all under this basket of liberty and the Constitution and being constitutionalists, but we have a distinct voice. We're not all the same. We have different ideas. Robert?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And Jason, I want to go back to something, back to this Myrtle Beach story for a second. So I think for those like me that wasn't around when this story was breaking, because I'm in Clarion County, so I learned about it through talking to Todd, Carlos, and people like yourself. One of the things that's amazing to this story is how every day, the more I hear about it, it's more of a microcosm of all the things we see wrong in our national level politics. So, for example, when you're talking about how the school failed actual victims that will suffer through this through the rest of their life, but they could virtue signal and say, well, systemic racism. We see this occurring in all of our institutions. So there's this narrative coming from groups like Black Lives Matter that says there's systemic racism, which is another way of saying the institutions that run this country are racist. Yet this is the first revolution we've ever seen that's coming from the powerful and from these institutions. Every one of these institutions can't wait to pay more and more lip service to Black Lives Matter. So the irony is we end up with situations such as Minneapolis, where you have a Democratic mayor, Democratic chief of police, Democratic attorney general, and they've been Democratic for decades, yet they're all claiming that their systems are racist. Well, who made them so then? If there's systemic racism in the policing of Minneapolis, and it's been controlled by people that are constantly saying there's systemic racism, words are cheap. What are you doing to solve it then? And the reality is it's because they don't believe what they're saying. They just say this because it's an easy way to avoid criticism. And at the top level of our government, in the establishment Republican and Democratic Party, what they fear most is people holding them accountable for the fact that they haven't done anything to help working class people in this country, whether you be black, Hispanic, white, Asian, man, woman, straight, gay. It doesn't matter. They don't care about you. And they found out this grift. Oh, all we have to do is say a few code words, and then all criticism goes away. And so that's why I think you're exactly right, Jason, is that that's what's happening here in the Myrtle Beach story, where I feel like that you're absolutely right. They're virtue signaling. They're saying they know that Todd's coming out with this story, so they're like, oh, well, if we just take the ultimate virtuous position of, yes, we're all systemically racist, then all of a sudden we can shirk our responsibility for the terrible choices we made in helping enable young men and being sexually assaulted. So I know that wasn't really a question, but do you have any comments on that?
I certainly have a response to it. I think that, look, is there racism in this country? Yes, but I don't believe that it's systemic racism. And racism is terrible. It has no place in American life. We're all equal. It's the way I live my life. But what if these victims are minorities? Imagine, what are these folks going to say then? So when you have an opportunity, the way that we are judged is when you have an opportunity to respond to an actual situation. It's how do you respond to it? I can tell you one thing right now. I love the police. I'm a big supporter of the police. I think the Williamsport Police Department is great. But can I tell you that if I saw one instance of racism, I would address it directly and immediately, regardless of whether that person was my friend. If I saw them doing what they did to George Floyd, if that was in the way of sports, I don't think these people would. I don't think they would stand up, because I think that it's easy. It's easy to say that there's systemic racism. It's easy to say these kinds of things that are popular and woke, or whatever the new word is, or whatever. My daughter just explained to me what that meant. But it's much harder when you're actually faced with a decision. Keep in mind that we are judged not by what we say, but what we do. What does somebody do when nobody's watching, right? And when nobody's going to be held responsible? And what do they do to people who can do nothing to help them in their mind or to hurt them? And I think that in this situation, the leaders at the Williamsport School District, and I could be wrong, and if I am, I'll apologize, but based upon all the evidence that I've seen, they did not act, they did not lead, and therefore, in my mind, my opinion is that they have no credibility. Okay, that's my opinion. And I had somebody, say to me, well, you represented the Williamsport School District before, you did some work for them. Yeah, I got them $1.1 million. For a project for Millionaires Drive. I wish I would have done it, quite frankly, because, and I pay so much in taxes to that district. And it's sad for me to say, and I'm a believer in, I think the Loyalsock School District's great, the Early Shore School District's great. We've seen how they handled a similar situation, not related to sexual assault, but a racial issue. They responded to it right away, took care of it. But it hurts me that I live in the city, and two of my kids, because of a divorce, go to Loyalsock School District. I love that they're there, but I will not send my son to the Williamsport School District. And I'm not one of these guys that's opposed to public schools, necessarily, although it's the debate of why I think we should have a discussion about school choice at least. But yeah, I would not feel safe sending my child to a school district that is led by people who will ignore these kinds of things.
And I'll just say real quick.
I can't believe that more people are not outraged by this.
Right?
I think that the outrage on this is just beginning.
And real quick, just to say on like the idea that words are cheap, I was in debate in university, and it was the leftist of the left, and I was considered kind of an anomaly in that I was right wing, but I was polite, so they tolerated me. I remember one time I was talking to a bunch of people that were in charge of debate communities at their particular school, so professors getting paid six figures to be in these big national programs. And they were telling me about that they were aware how bad rape is in the debate community and sexual assault. And they said, we know for a fact, I said, well, wait a minute, you've maybe heard rumors, but you don't know for a fact. They said, we know for a fact, we have the evidence that some of these program directors have literally sexually assaulted and raped some of their students. To which my response, and these are people that constantly criticize me for not believing we have a patriarchy, for not, back then it wasn't called Me Too, but for not believing like hashtag believe all women. I just try to approach things sensibly. And I said, so wait, you're aware of a rape that occurred? Did you call the authorities? Well, no, because it could harm our job prospects. And I said, how dare you be a moral superior to me? I don't care if I'm fired and end up taking a job making minimum wage. I'm not going to allow a rape to occur and say, well, I can't speak up because of my financial prospects. And this is exactly what we're seeing in the Williamsport School District as far as the evidence that I've seen. And it's exactly what we've seen over and over. For example, you take Hollywood, all of the sexual assaults that actually happen there, they ignore it. And then they say, well, we'll virtue signal about other things, and therefore it's all okay. That's one of the things that's the most outrageous about this. These catchy phrases and slogans allow people that claim to be your moral superiors and claim that they have some high ground to lecture you from. They're actually involved in some of the most despicable acts of silence that you could imagine.
Jason, your sound isn't very strong. So I wanted before you answer that question regarding the Hollywood hypocrisy, I wanted to make sure that I repeated what you said. You at one point acquired a $1.1 million grant for the Williamsport Area School District. Can you tell us what that was for? Because you cut out right after you said that.
Is this better now?
A little.
A little.
The problem is with this microphone.
I think it's your gain or something, but I'm not an audio whiz, so I wouldn't know.
How about now?
A little better.
So what was the $1.1 million grant that you got?
I worked with Jeff Richards, who's a former business manager at Williamsport School District. He's a great guy, by the way. And we were working on getting money for the stadium, but because of some issues, the Commonwealth had indicated they didn't want to award monies for both stadiums. It was $1.1 million multimodal grant to pave Millionaires Drive.
Okay.
And I should say I'm happy about that because it saved the taxpayers some money, but I would never work with them. Not under this leadership. I would do it under this leadership.
Yeah, you cut out right after you were happy. What? You cut out after you said you were happy that.
I'm happy that they got it. I guess I said I'm happy that they got it, but I would never do any more work for them under this leadership.
So your thoughts on the Hollywood hypocrisy and the politics of that? It's pretty effective, though, right?
What's that?
The Hollywood hypocrisy politically is very effective, correct?
Very much so. And I think that, when you look at the fact that, look, if it weren't for Todd Bartley and Robert and Carlos talking about this issue at the school district, how would we even know about it? Right?
Right.
The hypocrisy is that is what I think we've seen here. I think that one of two things has occurred. I don't like to, assign motives to people, but either they're trying to distract from this very, very serious situation, which is now being investigated by the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office, okay? Or they're acting in a hypocritical manner. Neither one of those things are good. It's very, very easy to put out these kind of statements. It's very easy, particularly in today's culture, to say that there's systemic racism, that that's a major problem. I think there are systemic problems in the Williamsport School District that need to be addressed. I think there's a cover-up culture. I think that's what they need to look at.
Agreed.
Jason, if I can follow up on your point and just I want to do it as a hypothetical, okay? I want to do it as a hypothetical. A couple of what ifs, okay? What if the Attorney General's office is investigating this case, and what if it turns out that a victim or multiple victims or folks involved in this that have knowledge, right, potentially are minority? And that doesn't necessarily mean they're black. I mean, they could be of any minority, right? They could be Asian, they could be of Mexican descent, any minority, right? What happens in a scenario where the Attorney General finds fault or criminal liability with any number of adults in this spectrum of this whole thing? And then what happens in a civil litigation potentially led by Klein and Spector when you mention the systemic issues beyond race that the district's dealing with? How deep and wide are those issues going to be if those hypotheticals play themselves out?
From a political point of view.
Sure. So I can't speak to the. Is my audio okay, by the way, now?
It goes in and out, but go ahead.
Okay. I think that it would be devastating from a public relations standpoint for the school district. And again, I'm not an attorney, but the situation would be if there were minority victims and it was part of a cover-up. There are a couple of potentials here. Obviously, the people who, did or allegedly on video sexually assaulting someone. If that person is a person of color, I would suggest that also the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division should be looking into that to see if, in fact, they talk about systemic racism, but maybe there was some real racism there, right? That would be carefully reviewed. But I guess from my mind, as the father of 3 children, if one of my children was sexually assaulted by, teammates, I would hope that the first people who would stand up would be their coaches and their administrators. And the fact that they didn't, to me, that I believe that someone who excuses that type of behavior is just as bad as the person who did it. And I think that if it's shown that they did it with malice, they should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and they should be fired. But from a public relations standpoint, I think it's very harmful. But on the public relations standpoint becomes, from my life, but who the hell is going to report on it other than you? I mean, nobody else has talked about it. Like, we have this deal here, I guess, in Lycoming County where we don't talk about things that involve people that we don't like, right? I mean, Todd, they don't saying things about you. They don't have any problem saying things about me. But if it's not one of the people who against the establishment, they don't even talk about it. So I think that we really have to have a discussion about that. And it's why these new media opportunities are coming up in Lycoming County, is because there's such a desire for the truth for people. But I think it would be devastating. By the way, Klein Inspector, one of the best law firms, not just in Pennsylvania, but in the country. It does concern me as a taxpayer, I guess. There was some calculations that I did the other day, that lawsuits against the Williamsport School District cost the average, and I'll be getting some more information out on this, cost the average homeowner in Williamsport $186 a year. We pay $160 a year to pay for lawsuits against the city, which could arguably be, the result there. Now we're going to add this to the bill. How much do the people of Williamsport have to pay for the mistakes of these so-called leaders? Because you know what? We're overtaxed right now. Lycoming County is 66 out of 67 counties in wage growth. We can't afford more taxes. So the problem that bothers me is, I think they're probably going to win. I think they're probably going to win a lot of money. That's who pays for it.
So we wanted to thank you for coming on today, and we look forward for you to come on again.
Thank you. Hopefully we get these audio issues fixed. I've got all this fancy equipment here and it's not working.
And what we will do is we will rely on your political take on certain issues. And I wanted to thank you for taking the time on a Saturday. I know that you spend, the weekends are the time that you spend with your family. So I appreciate you coming on, and we will talk to you soon.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Jason.
Thanks, Fitz.
Thanks, guys.
Robert, give me an example of, and what I would like to focus on in the time that we have remaining, 21 minutes, is the situation with the Williamsport Area School District and the comments made by Jennifer Lake. And there are numerous, but let's start the conversation with, give me an example of systemic racism.
So people throw this word around. Understand that systemic is interchanged with institutional racism. So the argument is that our institutions are directly themselves